Hi folks, it's Andrew here from Plainfield Public Library. I'm back with another episode of our live classic serial, and today is going to be our fourth episode from The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. If you're new here, we've been doing this for some time. You can actually go back to our playlists, and here on the YouTube channel you can see such things as our past readings from various different Sherlock Holmes stories. And if you were to go to our Facebook page, you would see more than a couple of years worth of other stories as well. However, getting back to today, let's carry on with part 4 of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This has been a story which is rapidly resembling a ghost story. The heroine of the story, whom is the narrator, she's been taken on as a governess for two small children who live in an isolated house with no one really there but a few servants and Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper. She's taken on this position with the sole condition from her employer that she never bother him at all, no matter what happens. So the children are there for the summer. The boy has been brought back from his boarding school but has been expelled from the school for reasons that we don't particularly know, except that he is bad. We don't really know exactly what that is. But the main thing that's been happening in the story is that the governess has been taking the children for walks and things like that, and she feels like they're observed. And in fact she's seen various different figures. She's seen a man on the battlement, and when she's gone into the drawing room downstairs she saw a man looking in the window from the outside, a man who subsequently seems to have vanished. And when she's been talking this over with Mrs. Gross, not only does Mrs. Gross seem maybe to know a little bit about this, but she also knows that the person whom the governess is describing seems to be none other than Mr. Quint. A Mr. Quint who was there before she got there, and a Mr. Quint who had actually died. So we may be dealing with a ghost story here. But let's carry on with the story and see what happens next in The Turn of the Screw with Chapter 7. I got hold of Mrs. Gross as soon after this as I could. This is, she'd been out with the kids at a lake and felt them to be observed by some sort of figure on the shore. I got hold of Mrs. Gross as soon after this as I could, and I can give no intelligible account of how I fought out the interval. Yet I still hear myself cry as I fairly threw myself into her arms. They know! It's too monstrous! They know! They know! And what on earth? I felt her incredulity as she held me. Why, all that we know, and heaven knows what else besides. Then as she released me, I made it out to her. Perhaps only now with full coherency even to myself. 2 hours ago in the garden. I could scarce articulate. Flora saw. Mrs. Gross took it as she might have taken a blow in the stomach. She has told you, she panted. Not a word. That's the horror. She kept it to herself. That child of 8, that child. Unutterable still for me was the stupefaction of it. Mrs. Gross, of course, could only gape the wider. Then how do you know? I was there. I saw, with my eyes, saw that she was perfectly aware. Do you mean of him? No, of her. I was conscious as I spoke that I looked prodigious things, for I got the slow reflection of them in my companion's face. Another person, this time, but a figure of quite as unmistakable horror and evil. A woman in black, pale and dreadful, with such an air also, and such a face. On the other side of the lake, I was there with the child, quiet for the hour, and in the midst of it, she came. Came how? From where? From where they come from. She just appeared and stood there, but not so near. And without coming nearer? Oh, for the effect and the feeling, she might have been as close as you. My friend, with an odd impulse, fell back a step. Was she someone you've never seen? Yes, but someone the child has. Someone you have. Then, to show how I'd thought it all out, my predecessor, the one who died. Miss Jessel. Miss Jessel. You don't believe me? I pressed. She turned right and left in her distress. How can you be sure? This drew from me, in the state of my nerves, a flash of impatience. Then ask Flora. She's sure. But I had no sooner spoken than I caught myself up. No, for God's sake, don't. She'll say she isn't. She'll lie. Mrs. Grose was not too bewildered instinctively to protest. How can you? Because I'm clear. Flora doesn't want me to know. It's only then to spare you. No, there are depths, depths. The more I go over it, the more I see in it, and the more I see in it, the more I fear. I don't know what I don't see, what I don't fear. Mrs. Grose tried to keep up with me. You mean you're afraid of seeing her again? No, that's nothing now. Then I explained, it's of not seeing her. But my companion only looked wan. I don't understand you. Why, it's that the child may keep it up, and that the child assuredly will, without my knowing it. At the image of this possibility, Mrs. Grose for a moment collapsed, yet presently to pull herself together again, as if from the positive force of the sense of what, should we yield an inch, there would be really to give way to. Dear, dear, we must keep our heads. And after all, if she doesn't mind it, she even tried a grim joke, perhaps she likes it. Likes such things? A scrap of an infant? Isn't it just a proof of her blessed innocence? My friend bravely inquired. She brought me, for the instant, almost round. We must clutch at that. We must cling to it. If it isn't a proof of what you say, it's a proof of God knows what. For the woman's a horror of horrors. Mrs. Grose at this fixed her eyes a minute on the ground. Then, at last raising them, "Tell me how you know," she said. "Then you admit it's what she was?" I cried. "Tell me how you know," my friend simply repeated. "No, by seeing her, by the way she looked." "At you, do you mean? So wickedly?" "Dear me, no, I could have borne that. She never gave me a glance. She only fixed the child." Mrs. Grose tried to see it. "Fixed her? Ah, with such awful eyes." She stared at mine as if they might really have resembled them. "Do you mean of dislike?" "God help us, no, of something much worse." "Worse than dislike?" This left her at indeed a loss. "With a determination indescribable, with a kind of fury of intention." I made her turn pale. Intention to get hold of her. Mrs. Grose, her eyes just lingering on mine, gave a shudder and walked to the window, and while she stood there looking out, I completed my statement. "That's what Flora knows." After a little she turned round. "The person was in black, you say? In mourning? Rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, with extraordinary beauty." I now recognised to what I had at last, stroke by stroke, brought the victim of my confidence, for she quite visibly waited this. "Oh, handsome, very, very," I insisted. "Wonderfully handsome. But infamous." She slowly came back to me. "Miss Jessel was infamous." She once more took my hand in both of her own, holding it as tight as if to fortify me against the increase of alarm I might draw from this disclosure. "They were both infamous," she finally said. So for a little we faced it once more together, and I found absolutely a degree of help in seeing it now so straight. "I appreciate," I said, "the great decency of your not having hitherto spoken, but the time has certainly come to give me the whole thing." She appeared to assent to this, but still only in silence, seeing which I went on. "I must have it now. Of what did she die? Come, there was something between them." "There was everything." "In spite of the difference? Of their rank, their condition?" She brought it woefully out. "She was a lady." I turned it over. I again saw. Yes, she was a lady. "And he so dreadfully below," said Mrs. Grose. I felt that I doubtless needn't press too hard in such company on the place of a servant in the scale, but there was nothing to prevent an acceptance of my companion's own measure of my predecessor's abasement. There was a way to deal with that, and I dealt, the more readily for my full vision, on the evidence of our employer's late, clever, good-looking own man. Impudent, assured, spoiled, depraved. The fellow was a hound. Mrs. Grose considered, as if it were, perhaps, a little case for a sense of shades. "I've never seen one like him. He did what he wished. With her. With them all. It was as if now in my friend's own eyes Miss Jessel had again appeared. I seemed at any rate for an instant to see their evocation of her as distinctly as I had seen her by the pond, and I brought out with decision, "It must have been also what she wished." Mrs. Groce's face signified that it had been, indeed, but she said at the same time, "Poor woman, she paid for it." "Then you do know what she died of?" I asked. "No, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't, and I thanked heaven she was well out of this." "Yet you had then your idea of her real reason for leaving?" "Yes, as to that. She couldn't have stayed. Fancy it here, for a governess. And afterwards I imagined, and I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful." "Not so dreadful as what I do," I replied, on which I must have shown her, as I was indeed but too conscious, a front of miserable defeat. It brought out again all her compassion for me, and at the renewed touch of her kindness my power to resist broke down. I burst as I had the other time, made her burst into tears. She took me to her motherly breast, and my lamentations overflowed. "I don't do it," I sobbed in despair. "I don't save or shield them. It's far worse than I dreamed. They're lost." Chapter 8. What I'd said to Mrs. Grose was true enough. There were, in the matter I had put before her, depths and possibilities that I lacked resolution to sound, so that when we met once more in the wonder of it, we were of a common mind about the duty of resistance to extravagant fancies. We were to keep our heads, if we should keep nothing else, difficult indeed as that might be in the face of what in our prodigious experience was least to be questioned. Late that night, while the house slept, we had another talk in my room, when she went all the way with me as to its being beyond doubt that I had seen exactly what I had seen. To hold her perfectly in the pinch of that, I found I had only to ask her how, if I had made it up, I came to be able to give of each of the persons appearing to me a picture disclosing to the last detail their special marks, a portrait on the exhibition of which she had instantly recognised and named them. She wished, of course, small blame to her, to sink the whole subject, and I was quick to assure her that my own interest in it had now violently taken the form of a search for the way to escape from it. I encountered her on the ground of a probability with that recurrence, for recurrence we took for granted. I should get used to my danger, distinctly professing that my personal exposure had suddenly become the least of my discomforts. It was my new suspicion that was intolerable, and yet even to this complication the later hours of the day had brought a little ease. On leaving her, after my first outbreak, I had of course returned to my pupils, associating the right remedy for my dismay with that sense of their charm, which I had already found to be a thing I could positively cultivate, and which had never failed me yet. I had simply, in other words, plunged afresh into Flora's special society, and there become aware, it was almost a luxury, that she could put her little conscious hand straight upon the spot that ached. She had looked at me in a sweet speculation, and then had accused me to my face of having cried. I had supposed I had brushed away all the ugly signs. But I could, literally, for the time at all events, rejoice under this fathomless charity, that they had not entirely disappeared. To gaze into the depths of the blue of the child's eyes and pronounce their loveliness a trick of premature cunning was to be guilty of a cynicism in preference to which I naturally preferred to abjure my judgment, and so far as might be, my agitation. I couldn't, naturally, I couldn't abjure for merely wanting to, but I could repeat to Mrs. Grose, as I did there over and over in the small hours, that with their voices in the air, their pressure on one's heart, and their fragrant faces against one's cheek, everything fell to the ground but their incapacity and their beauty. It was a pity that somehow to settle this once for all I had equally to re-enumerate the signs of subtlety that in the afternoon by the lake had made a miracle of my show of self-possession. It was a pity to be obliged to re-investigate the certitude of the moment itself, and repeat how it had come to me as a revelation that the inconceivable communion I then surprised was a matter for either party of habit. It was a pity that I should have had to quaver out again the reasons for my not having in my delusion so much as questioned that the little girl saw our visitant, even as I actually saw Mrs. Grose herself, and that she wanted, by just so much as she thus did see, to make me suppose she didn't. and at the same time, without showing anything, arrive at a guess as to whether I myself did. It was a pity that I needed once more to describe the portentous little activity by which she sought to divert my attention, the perceptible increase of movement, the greater intensity of play, the singing, the gabbling of nonsense, and the invitation to romp. Yet, if I had not indulged, to prove there was nothing in it, in this review, I should have missed the 2 or 3 dim elements of comfort that still remained to me. I should not, for instance, have been able to asseverate to my friend that I was certain, which was so much to the good, that I at least had not betrayed myself. I should not have been prompted by stress of need, by desperation of mind, I scarce know what to call it, to invoke such further aid to intelligence as might spring from pushing my colleague fairly to the wall. She had told me, bit by bit, under pressure, a great deal, but a small shifty spot on the wrong side of it all still sometimes brushed my brow like the wing of a bat. And I remember how on this occasion, for the sleeping house and the concentration alike of our danger and our watch seemed to help, I felt the importance of giving the last jerk to the curtain. "I don't believe anything so horrible," I recollect saying. "No, let us put it definitely, my dear, that I don't. But if I did, there's a thing I should require now, just without sparing you the least bit more. Not a scrap, come, to get out of you. What was it you had in mind when, in our distress, before Miles came back, over the letter from his school, you said, under my insistence, that you didn't pretend for him that he'd not literally ever been bad? He was not, literally, ever, in these weeks that I myself have lived with him and so closely watched him. He has been an imperturbable little prodigy of delightful, lovable goodness. Therefore you might perfectly have made the claim for him if you'd not, as it happened, seen an exception to take. What was your exception, and to what passage in your personal observation of him did you refer?" It was a dreadfully austere inquiry, but levity was not our note, and at any rate, before the grey dawn admonished us to separate, I'd got my answer. What my friend had in mind proved to be immensely to the purpose. It was neither more or less than the circumstance that for a period of several months Quint and the boy had been perpetually together. It was, in fact, the very appropriate truth that she had ventured to criticise the propriety, to hint at the incongruity of so close an alliance, and even to go so far on the subject as a frank overture to Miss Jessel. Miss Jessel had, with a most strange manner, requested her to mind her business, and the good woman had on this directly approached little Miles. What she'd said to him, since I pressed, was that she liked to see young gentlemen not forget their station. I pressed again, of course, at this. You reminded him that Quint was only a base menial, as you might say, and it was his answer, for one thing, that was bad. And for another thing? I waited. He repeated your words to Quint? Oh, no, not that. It's just what he wouldn't. She could still impress upon me. I was sure at any rate, she added, that he didn't, but he denied certain occasions. What occasions? When they'd been about together quite as if Quint were his tutor, and a very grand one, and Miss Jessel only for the little lady. When he'd gone off with the fellow, and spent hours with them. He then prevaricated about it, said he hadn't. Her assent was clear enough to cause me to add in a moment. I see. He lied. Oh, Mrs. Grose mumbled. This was a suggestion that it didn't matter, which indeed she backed up by a further remark. You see, after all, Miss Jessel didn't mind. She didn't forbid him. I considered. Did he put that to you as a justification? At this she dropped again. No, he never spoke of it. Never mentioned her in connection with Quint. She saw, visibly flushing, where I was coming out. Well, he didn't show anything. He denied, she repeated. He denied. Lord, how I pressed her now. So that you could see he knew what was between the two wretches. I don't know, the poor woman groaned. You do know, you dear thing, I replied. Only you haven't my dreadful boldness of mind, and you keep back, out of timidity and modesty and delicacy, even the impression that in the past, when you had, without my aid, to flounder about in silence, most of all made you miserable. But I shall get it out of you yet. There was something in the boy that suggested to you, I continued, that he covered and concealed their relation. I couldn't prevent your learning the truth. I dare say. But heavens, I fell with vehemence, a-thinking what it shows that they must to that extent have succeeded in making of him. Ah, nothing that's not nice now, Mrs. Grose lugubriously pleaded. I don't wonder you looked queer, I persisted, when I mentioned to you the letter from his school. I doubt if I looked as queer as you, she retorted with a homely force. And if he was so bad then as that comes to, how is he such an angel now? Yes, indeed, and if he was a fiend at school, how? Well, I said in my torment, you must put it to me again, but I shall not be able to tell you for some days. Only put it to me again. I cried in a way that made my friend stare. There are directions in which I must not for the present let myself go. Meanwhile, I returned to her first example, the one to which she just previously referred, of the boy's happy capacity for an occasional slip. If Quint, on your remonstrance at this time you speak of, if he was a base menial, one of the things Miles said to you, I find myself guessing, was that you were another. Again her admission was so adequate that I continued, and you forgave him that? Wouldn't you? Oh, yes. And we exchanged there in the stillness a sound of the oddest amusement. Then I went on, at all events, while he was with the man, Miss Flora was with the woman. It suited them all. It suited me too, I felt, only too well, by which I mean that it suited exactly the particularly deadly view I was in the very act of forbidding myself to entertain. But I so far succeeded in checking the expression of this view that I will throw just here no further light on it than may be offered by the mention of my final observation to Mrs. Grose. His having lied and been impudent are, I confess, less engaging specimens than I'd hoped to have from you of the outbreak in him of the little natural man. Still, I mused, they must do, for they make me feel more than ever that I must watch. It made me blush the next minute to see in my friend's face how much more unreservedly she'd forgiven him than her anecdote struck me as presenting to my own tenderness an occasion for doing. This came out when, at the schoolroom door, she quitted me. Surely you don't accuse him of carrying on an intercourse that he conceals from me? Remember that, until further evidence, I now accuse nobody. Then, before shutting her out to go by another passage to her own place, I must just wait, I wound up. Part 9. I waited, and the days as they elapsed took something from my consternation, a very few of them, in fact, passing in constant sight of my pupils without a fresh incident, sufficed to give to grievous fancies and even to odious memories a kind of brush of the sponge. I've spoken of the surrender to their extraordinary childish grace as a thing I could actively cultivate, and it may be imagined if I neglected now to address myself to this source for whatever it could yield. Stranger than I can express certainly was the effort to struggle against my new lights. It would doubtless have been, however, a greater tension still, had it not been so frequently successful. I used to wonder how my little charges could help guessing that I thought strange things about them, and the circumstance that these things only made them the more interesting was not by itself a direct aid to keeping them in the dark. I trembled lest they should see that they were so immensely more interesting. Putting things at the worst, at all events, as in meditation I so often did, any clouding of their innocence could only be, blameless and foredoomed as they were, a reason the more for taking risks. There were moments when, by an irresistible impulse, I found myself catching them up and pressing them to my heart. As soon as I'd done so, I used to say to myself, what will they think of that? Doesn't it betray too much? It would have been easy to get into a sad, wild tangle about how much I might betray, but the real account, I feel, of the hours of peace that I could still enjoy was that the immediate charm of my companions was a beguilement still effective even under the shadow of the possibility that it was studied. For if a moment it occurred to me that I might occasionally excite suspicion by the little outbreaks of my sharper passion for them, so too I remember wondering if I mightn't see a queerness in the traceable increase of their own demonstrations. They were at this period extravagantly and preternaturally fond of me, which after all I could reflect was no more than a graceful response in children perpetually bowed over and hugged. The homage of which they were so lavish succeeded, in truth, for my nerves quite as well as if I'd never appeared to myself, as I may say, literally to catch them at a purpose in it. They'd never, I think, wanted to do so many things for their poor protectress. I mean, though they got their lessons better and better, which was naturally what would please her most, in the way of diverting, entertaining, surprising her, reading her passages, telling her stories, acting her charades, pouncing out at her in disguises as animals and historical characters, and above all astonishing her by the pieces they had secretly got by heart and could interminably recite. I should never get to the bottom, were I to let myself go even now, of the prodigious private commentary, all under still more private correction, with which in these days I overscored their full hours. They'd shown me from the first a facility for everything, a general faculty which, having taken a fresh start, achieved remarkable flights. They got their little tasks as if they loved them, and indulged from the mere exuberance of the gift in the most unimposed little miracles of memory. They not only popped out at me as tigers and as Romans, but as Shakespeareans, astronomers, and navigators. This was so singularly the case that it had presumably much to do with the fact as to which at the present day I am at a loss for a different explanation. I allude to my natural composure on the subject of another school for Miles. What I remember is that I was content not for the time being to open the question, and that the contentment must have sprung from the sense of his perpetually striking show of cleverness. He was too clever for a bad governess, for a parson's daughter, to spoil, and the strangest, if not the brightest thread in the pensive embroidery I just spoke of was the impression I might have got, if I dared to work it out, that he was under some influence operating in his small intellectual life as a tremendous incitement. If it was easy to reflect, however, that such a boy could postpone school, it was at least as marked that for such a boy to have been kicked out by a schoolmaster was a mystification without end. Let me add that in their company now, and I was careful almost never to be out of it, I could follow no scent very far. We lived in a cloud of music and love and success and private theatricals. The musical sense in each of the children was of the quickest, but the elder in especial had a marvellous knack of catching and repeating. The schoolroom piano broke into all gruesome fancies, and when that failed there were confabulations in corners, with the sequel of one of them going out in the highest spirits in order to come in as something new. I'd had brothers myself, and it was no revelation to me that little girls could be slavish idolaters of little boys. What surpassed everything was that there was a little boy in the world who could have for the other sex and intelligence so fine a consideration. They were extraordinarily at one. And to say that they never either quarrelled or complained is to make the note of praise coarse for their quality of sweetness. Sometimes, indeed, when I dropped into coarseness, I perhaps came across traces of little understandings between them, by which one of them should keep me occupied while the other slipped away. There is a naïf side, I suppose, in all diplomacy, but if my pupils practised upon me, it was surely with the minimum of grossness. It was all in the other quarter that after a lull the grossness broke out. I find that I really hang back, but I must take my plunge. In going on with the record of what was hideous at Bly, I not only challenge the most liberal faith, for which I little care, but, and this is another matter, I renew what I myself suffered. I again push my way through it to the end. There came suddenly an hour after which, as I look back, the affair seems to me have been all pure suffering, but I have at least reached the heart of it, and the straightest road out is doubtless to advance. One evening, with nothing to lead up or prepare it, I felt the cold touch of the impression that had breathed on me the night of my arrival, and which much lighter then, as I have mentioned, I should probably have made little of in memory had my subsequent sojourn been less agitated. I had not gone to bed. I sat reading by a couple of candles. There was a roomful of old books at Bly, last century fiction, some of it, which was to the extent of a distinctly deprecated renown, but never to so much as that of a stray specimen, had reached the sequestered home and appealed to the unavowed curiosity of my youth. I remember that the book I had in my hand was Fielding's Amelia, also that I was wholly awake. I recall further both a general conviction that it was horribly late, and a particular objection to looking at my watch. I figure, finally, that the white curtain, draping in the fashion of those days the head of Flora's little bed, shrouded, as I had assured myself long before, the perfection of childish rest. I recollect, in short, that though I was deeply interested in my author, I found myself, at the turn of a page, and with his spell all scattered, looking straight up from him and hard at the door of my room. There was a moment during which I listened, reminded of the faint sense I'd had the first night of there being something undefinably astir in the house, and noted the soft breath of the open casement just move the half-drawn blind. Then, with all the marks of a deliberation that must have seemed magnificent had there been anyone to admire it, I laid down my book, rose to my feet, and taking a candle went straight out of the room, and from the passage, on which my light made little impression, noiselessly closed and locked the door. I can say now neither what determined nor what guided me, but I went straight along the lobby, holding my candle high, till I came within sight of the tall window that presided over the great turn of the staircase. At this point I precipitately found myself aware of three things. They were practically simultaneous, yet they had flashes of succession. My candle, under a bold flourish, went out, and I perceived by the uncovered window that the yielding dusk of earliest morning rendered it unnecessary. Without it, the next instant I saw that there was someone on the stair. I speak of sequences, but I required no lapse of seconds to stiffen myself for a third encounter with Quint. The apparition had reached the landing halfway up, and was therefore on the spot nearest the window, where at sight of me it stopped short and fixed me exactly as it had fixed me from the tower and from the garden. He knew me as well as I knew him, and so in the cold, faint twilight, with a glimmer in the high glass and another on the polish of the oak stair below, we faced each other in our common intensity. He was absolutely, on this occasion, a living, detestable, dangerous presence. But that was not the wonder of wonders. I reserved this distinction for quite another circumstance, the circumstance that dread had unmistakably quitted me, and that there was nothing in me there that didn't meet and measure him. I had plenty of anguish after that extraordinary moment, but I had, thank God, no terror, and he knew I had not. I found myself at the end of an instantly magnificently aware of this. I felt, in a fierce rigour of confidence, that if I stood my ground a minute I should cease, for the time at least, to have him to reckon with, and during the minute, accordingly, the thing was as human and hideous as a real interview. Hideous just because it was human as to have met alone in the small hours, in a sleeping house, some enemy, some adventurer, some criminal. It was the dead silence of our long gaze at such close quarters that gave the whole horror, huge as it was, its only note of the unnatural. If I'd met a murderer in such a place, and at such an hour, we still at least would have spoken. Something would have passed in life between us. If nothing had passed, one of us would have moved. The moment was so prolonged that it would have taken but little more to make me doubt if even I were in life. I can't express what followed it, save by saying that the silence itself, which was indeed in a manner an attestation of my strength, became the element into which I saw the figure disappear, in which I definitely saw it turn, as I might have seen the low wretch to which it had once belonged turn on receipt of an order, and pass, with my eyes on the villainous back that no hunch could have more disfigured, straight down the staircase and into the darkness in which the next bend was lost. Well, folks, I've run out of time today. That's it from me this week from The Turn of the Screw. I'll be back again on Monday at 2 o'clock to read chapter 10. I hope you can join me then. And in the meantime, thanks for joining me today and have a very good weekend. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye for now.